exactly got a lot in the name, has it? And obviously the theme is patently ridiculous, so I don't want to pick something to do with some character in the game. So the concept of this show is going to be me and Yiska and or guests, depending on if we can rope other people into this sort of content suicide pact, are going to talk about ideas in Overwatch, which hopefully are novel, hopefully spark some thought. I would say some discussion, but frankly, I've had enough. I've had my fill of discussion for a lifetime, mate, at least on Reddit. So the first episode, we're coming out with straight fire, because a lot of you out there love to talk about and speculate on, to a lesser degree, watch the Dallas Fuel, because obviously they are filled with huge names in Western Overwatch, some of the most storied players we've had. Still to this day, I'll admit, despite how much many of their players have decayed, I even look at the lineup and still think, surely they can get some wins sooner. You know, it still doesn't feel like that's how I know it hasn't gone complete to shit. It still doesn't feel right that they can't succeed. So within this context, you'll often have heard this opinion from me myself on Oversight. I actually think that the logic of blowing the team up and starting with Effect as the new squad, to me, I have to say, as a naive layman, I would probably recommend that if I was talking to Hastro, because whenever I watched the Dallas Fuel, as much as everyone loves those other names, I think practically every other name on the list, except some of the Koreans who had their own reasons to not be in the lineup or got kicked, etc., almost everyone else, I thought generally had some issues, clearly had some sort of personal issues with people in the team, whereas actually the whole time, in a mad way, I've almost got more respect for Effect from the way he's been able to play in the server. If you ignore everything he's said and done outside the server, just the way he's played, I actually think he, on some level, he must have some sort of stoic ability to just withstand teammates just falling apart, the team not playing well, obviously losing lots of games. He has still performed. I won't go over the top and say he's the best player, but he's been a very competent player in the Overwatch League. At times, still looked like a star player in the Overwatch League, even on what I would consider a pretty fucking bad and badly run team. So obviously, the general consensus is not too dissimilar to that. I think a lot of people think he's the best part about Dallas Fuel, and he's probably the only thing that's keeping them in it at this point in time, and he's one of the clear parts that if you're going to try and salvage something, you would probably go with. So the premise that you came up with, though, is a pretty intriguing one, which is that in a different sense, Effect could also be what holds the team back while simultaneously being the one thing that keeps them afloat, as it were, to whatever degree they're afloat. So kind of unpack some of that for me. What were your first thoughts and what kind of led you to this idea?
So I think almost 2 years ago, I wrote an article about Envious, and that was back in the time when they, Apex Season 1 was happening, and they signed on Mickey, and the name of the article was Don't Marry the Meta. And basically it was about, getting a diva specialist in, and then, sort of getting caught up in these compositions, because keep in mind, this was in an era where there were only 6 players on each team, right? So
yes, flexibility
was limited in that sense, right? I would say nowadays it's don't marry the hyper carry. So with Effect coming in, they sort of slotted into a hole, and for the time being, I'd liken them to almost like a Moscow 5. So just briefly, unpack what for Overwatch fans what Moscow 5 was basically a League of Legends team from Russia, and they were, I would argue, world beaters at one point, and could have definitely won worlds and whatever. And as soon as the LCS started and the circumstances of the tournaments changed to a much more high upkeep, and as well as them staying in Russia and having to fly over, that basically destroyed that team. Now, in the same sense, Envious was the team that, once again, had these circumstances in Apex, and they sort of kind of managed right for a while. I think their Moscow 5 moment is right now, where everything is completely changing the way Overwatch has been played. And then the worst part that could have actually happened to that team was Effect joining, in the sense that he was the crutch for them, right? The fact that it worked so effortlessly in contenders kept them from making the decisions that would have been necessary before coming into Overwatch League. So some of that we've heard, right? With for instance, Hastra saying that they want more, buddy culture. This has been proven to not work in any team in the Overwatch League. It's just, there are too many egos, the schedule is too rigorous. So I'd argue that Effect and Envious, or I get not Envious, but the Dallas Fuel have to part ways simply because on a difference of almost ideology or mindset, right? How they approach things. Because I think in another world, for instance, Philadelphia didn't pick up Carpe and picked up Effect, and Effect is now the Carpe of Fusion, and in a more structured way is able to dominate that league as much as Carpe has, for a while at least.
Okay, so there's a few things that we can get into. So to start off with, when you said that line, it's a great slogan, like, don't marry the hyper carry. Was that also in the sense of the fact that, like in the case of Effect, for example, if we come to a world where you don't play stuff like Tracer, does it make not as much sense anymore to make that kind of the person you build your team? Is that kind of what you're alluding to there?
Yes, and most definitely. Also because the other picks that Effect plays, other than Genji, and he's serviceable at that, but certainly not outstanding, but those roles were already filled by Taimu, weren't they? So his Effect's Widow is average in the Overwatch League. His McCree is good. His Tracer, now, because of the new meta, and we've seen the pick rate go down significantly, right? That might become a liability. Now, I wouldn't put it past Effect to learn a new character. Definitely also, I've heard he's willing to do that. So that isn't inherently the problem. Obviously, yes, that currently it looks to be one because his strongest pick, much like, for instance, someone like Striker, has now been losing power levels simply because of the meta change, right?
Okay, and then the other part there is when you gave the contrast to the Fusion, is this like he's someone where if you're going to have the buddy environment, you're going to allow a lot of big egos, and you're going to hope they all get along with some kind of, I mean, I guess you're just praying for some sort of chemistry that just holds everything together there, or just not losing. Is the implication there if he was in sort of a more business-like team where it was like, here's the structure and here's the squad and you're just going to play in this way and it's going to be more like, I hate to say serious because I'm sure in their own way they'll want to be serious, but is it something along these lines? This is why you think he would be suited elsewhere? I mean, just the fact that he's Korean and very good, I already could see how that's going to be a mismatch against some of these players that he's currently grouped with in Dallas Fuel. So where do you go with that point?
Yeah, I think just as a culture fit. So the problem is that you have unarguably the best player on Dallas Fuel is someone that obviously then commands certain changes, like every hyper carry or rather star player should in a team, right? But at the same time, I don't think he can call that well, right? His English is still fairly limited. I mean, from what I've heard, he tries definitely, and in certain aspects, I mean, we've seen him try to accommodate teammates, right? But in the end, it always comes down to him trying to get back to that carry focus style where he just goes off, tries to solo people. And that is the expression of that in the game, that he simply goes off and doesn't do things that Tracers usually do in the Overwatch League, which is something like Prophet sets up with gesture, or Sebiolvi goes onto the flanks and tries to duel them in order to keep the Zenyatta safe or whatever. That has happened. That last part has changed a little bit with Anku coming in and guiding him around a little bit more. Though, to be fair, I mean, the entire system, and it is a systematic failure in the Fuel, has not been kind to Effect. Right. So it's just, if we are talking about a situation between chaos and order, I think without having talked to Effect ever, just having seen him on social media, how he reacts, he's someone that works better in a more orderly team than in a chaotic team.
Okay. Did you ever follow CS:GO at all?
Yes.
Okay, are you familiar with the time when the Ukrainian player Simple was in Team Liquid? It was a couple of years ago.
Yes.
So no one has to know who's watching this episode now. This is not going to be like in-depth stuff about Counter-Strike. It's just going to be an analogy which will set up my point here, which is what happened was there was this player called Simple who already 3 years ago, if you just watched him play, you could already see like mechanically he was a fantastically talented player. But in his home region of the CIS region in Eastern Europe, he was essentially like, he had kind of like a glass ceiling that was stopping him getting higher because he'd already been on a very good team, Hellraisers, and they'd kicked him out because he was just too, I mean, I hate to use the word toxic because it's such a terrible term, but in as much as it has the pejorative connotation of like corrosive, he definitely was that. Like if you had him in a team, you either needed like really like battle-tested veterans who just don't give a fuck what someone says to them, or you needed to just never lose a game. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with this guy because he's so good, and yet at the same time, he's going to be such a negative element. Now, what happened was, because he couldn't go any higher, he was stuck in like basically like a team that was never going to be vaguely close to his talent. So what happened was I was friends with a couple of notable people within the Team Liquid organization who had a North American team, and their North American team had already tried just all these different NA players, and they'd gotten to the level where you're like right on the cusp of actually being a good team, but you can't quite break through. Like you're always just close to beating a top team, but you never do it. And you know, even when you're like things are going well, you just know they're gonna like somehow blow the game. And I basically said, because they'd thought, well, there's not really any other like NA player who's like the missing piece for us, you know, there's no key piece we could pick up right now. I said, well, okay, in that scenario, you have to ask yourself, like, do I want to stay with what I've got now? Do I want to risk getting slightly better but slightly worse? Or I can tell you an option that's basically like the nuclear option. You can get this guy over here, and by the way, he doesn't speak good English, he's going to be a terrible teammate, but you know what? The difference is if he had a good game, you might actually be able to beat the best team in the world. And then that was a good pitch. It worked. They were able to get him in. He already had like a little bit of history with one of the players, which is why this was a possibility. They got him into the team, and immediately he was really good. But before they'd even played their first tournaments, they were already telling me, like, you got to know though, like the team environment with him is just so bad. Like, how can, like, you know, even though his skills are good, how can we justify keeping him in? 'Cause it just won't work. And I said this, okay, I said, right, here's the thing. In a way, it's terrible that he's so talented but so bad as a teammate. But in your team, this will actually help you. Because what's going to happen is he is such a bad teammate, and in a very specific way, where the kind of person he's going to get on is actually not even just the worst player, the person who doesn't try or who thinks, oh, let's not fight, or, you know, avoids conflict. And I said, what this will do, hopefully, is since you have committed to the idea in the long run, you want your team to be really fucking good, whether he's here or not, he is going to burn out all the dead wood in this team. And anyone at the time, right, who thought I was exaggerating, it literally happened. The two players in this team who were the most dead weight was the in-game leader was a guy called Adren, who was like, you know, he was never going to get better. He was at the end of an already storied career. So he went out the team. Then they had a player called Fogley. He actually still plays. He plays for a team called NRG, which is like a lower level team now. He was also someone where he had outside of the game reasons he wasn't going to improve much. In game, he'd sort of capped out. These players just did not last. And then even the players in the team who did last, here's what's amazing, is even though Simple's period in the team only lasted, you know, like collectively a couple of spans of a few months, even him being in the team and being so bad, when he left the team, the reason he left and was never re-signed is because one of the players in the team even was like, I'll never play with that guy again. And they were like, in the team, they were like, dude, come on, have you seen how good he is? Like, you know, we just got to like final of a major, we did all these amazing, and then the player literally, it prompted this player to come out of his shell. This player had been a very reserved player, as a player Elige, and had been the guy who was just like a very passive aggressive, like, you know, it's not my fault, but also, you know, don't put any pressure on me. It forced this guy to make the ultimatum of like, okay, kick this guy, because you know what? I'll be the simple of this team. And that was such a ridiculous concept at the time. I'm not joking. Within 3 months, this player started to become like the NA, like that level of talent. Like not quite, because Simple's actually turned out to be sort of like the faker of the game, but at the time it was a comparable. Now, the reason I'm bringing up this analogy is, this is where I wonder if you've got a point about maybe it being the wrong environment. Because if Effect didn't have the same, for start off, language inability to communicate, and so you could put a lot of the resources into him and be like, you know what, you're right, pick the players we should kick from the teams, no problem with that. there'd be a logic to it, there would be a way to rebuild with him. Or he could even act as burning out the deadwood, like he'd get rid of the guys who couldn't compete now. And even if we don't keep him, because it's wrong, he's kind of like helped us figure out in a really extreme circumstance who can stay and who can't. But one of the bizarre things about Fuel is, on the one hand, it seems like they are desperate to cater to effect, but they don't do it enough that it takes that extreme effect. They get into some weird no man's land in the middle where they keep some of the names who they're clearly if I actually had to sit down, Hastro, I'd say what is Seagull going to do in this team in a year from now? What is this other player here? Are you really going to keep Taimu forever? Are you just going to wait until it's almost like they just delay the hard decisions, but at the same time, they're telling this guy who is the talented player, no, we will get you the right players, and don't worry, things will improve. What do you think on this? Was there a way they could have gone either way? Either they could have gone to a fun team and marketed, or they could have kind of used effect to sort of smoke out anyone who wasn't material to be in this serious team that he probably needs?
So the one thing about Seagull, I will say, is that he's probably the best ratio of marketable player that's also very skilled at the game. I don't think it's a Shroud situation whatsoever with him, where it's like, okay, you're basically underperforming in game.
But the thing is, though, they don't really force him into the team. Then in that scenario, I'd go, okay, cool, I'm gonna make this work. Let's go. Let's see. Go all in.
Yeah, and that was certainly internal stuff that was going on there. But yeah, I think in general, if you go through the changes that have happened in this team before Effect left, basically everyone other than Mickey, because I guess they couldn't until they brought in Seagull, and then that was more like a mishap. But everyone else was replaced in their role, weren't they? At least at some point.
Yes.
So Effect has been that one constant, and he's been trying to accommodate all these changes. But once again, it's too much chaos. It just doesn't work. If you want to run your organization like that, which very well might happen, right? I guess that worked for Envious in some regard, right? In CSGO, right? Yes. Where they kept reshuffling and have this chaotic, and it's geniuses in that team. And eventually you will have the right chemistry between them, and then you have that alchemic potion that just explodes in everyone's faces, and you have the formula, and it just works, right? This is not a team, I think, that can work. So in that alchemic formula, there's no effect in there. I don't think that's something that he should aspire to be in. I actually think that. So if I guess an apt comparison would be something like Shore4 in Cloud9. So Shore4 in Cloud9 got several chances. So repeatedly the team was built around him because he was simply the best player on that team. Sure. It was very hard to argue with that. And then it happened again and again. New coaches were brought in, and eventually they just dropped it. And obviously then the rest is history, where Jake went with GC Busan and KDP instead of the NA lineup. Yeah. So Shore4 then went to Gladiators, and it didn't look. They looked like a lower mid-tier team until Fissure came in, and suddenly he had a player on his team who was, I would say, objectively a better Overwatch League player, more accomplished, higher skill in his role, even though that's hard to compare. If the Effect was to be put in a situation where he knows that he needs to grind to catch up to the actual star player in his team, so to be sort of like the second guy, and then have a team that is structured and knows how to treat people's psychology, I think this is where this guy completely goes beast mode and takes over the league. Much like, for instance, I mean, like a Striker did, like we had stage 1 with Flatter, we had Profit. This is the level of talent this guy has, if not more, right? So it's just very, it's not a ground he can be nurtured on. I don't think that's fine, right? So you just have to let it go then, is basically.
Because the thing is, I mean, it's good that you actually put it in context what you thought like his ceiling was there, because that's the weird way that you can do analysis, right? Is essentially it's just confirmation bias. So because a lot of the analysts in the Overwatch League who, by the way, if you asked them to break down the same Dallas Fuel game with no name tags on, and you didn't tell them it was Overwatch League, I bet they would be brutal, and they'd be like, "This is failing here. What are they doing? Do they even understand what these two players are doing?" You know, these guys know a lot about the game. The problem is, you get certain filters on your mind, and you will interpret information through those filters. So the filter most people have with the Dallas Fuel is, "Oh, I hope they can do it. Oh, it would be great if they can turn it around." Then obviously there's a secondary filter of, I know the fans want this to work, and am I here to entertain the fans? Am I here to, try to be the voice of the fan? They have all these problems, all these plates they're spinning while they're trying to look at the game objectively. And so the problem is, when I've seen a lot of the people analyze the Dallas Fuel games, they'll just be like, "Oh, sure, they lost 3-1, but you know what, that one map they won, at times it looked so good there." Or the worst one's probably like, "They only lost 3-2, it was a great game." But I have to say, in line with what you're saying here, all those games I watched, I would be going, no, it's the other way around. If Effect was playing that well in this match, and you were close to winning, and you fucked it up every time, that means it's not even just like a mistake from one player, or one player played badly. That means almost everything except Effect is probably falling apart. Now, yes, there are other factors I don't blame them for, like QXC, and then some of the scenarios where they had to kick people very quickly. Okay, fair enough. But it does feel like it was the worst sort of crutch. Because here's the thing. It'd be one thing if it was a crutch and you were like mid-table and like, "Oh, really got to make a decision if you want to make it." This is like you don't even win and you got a crutch that's telling you like, no, you don't have to amputate the leg. No, I'm fine. Look, I can sort of walk a bit. It's like, at this point, it's going to be the whole body you're going to have to amputate. What are you doing?
Yeah. It's almost miraculous to me how, I do these prediction things where I give every team percentages or whatever. Since Effect has been out of that team, I almost feel liberated whenever I have to think about Dallas Fuel, how they will go. I even put Shanghai as a slight favorite in that game because like last time it felt like to me, it was sheer power of will that they didn't lose the game last time. So not in stage 4, but in stage 3 that they didn't lose to Shanghai. It was just one guy deciding that he wasn't going to lose that game. And I almost can't express how sexy that was to me, that he came out and just completely beasted it. Like against what the analysts were obviously saying and everything. That was like, this is basically my anime, if you want, right? It's insane, yeah.
It's like if you're into competitive driving, that's just like pornography, basically. You're just like, well, this is what I paid, this is what I signed up for. And in fact, the sad thing is, because this actually happened again with the same player I referred in CS:GO. So Simple, in the current scenario, played for a team where now they're actually not that bad. Actually, they've sort of gotten their shit together, and now they're not a bad team. But at the beginning of the year, every aspect of the team was dysfunctional except him. And what's funny is, this is something that Stuchu actually talked about when he did a column on this topic, where he said that, like, in a perverse way, you actually hope that, like, this guy stays in bad teammate prison, because then that basically forces him to summon the most ridiculous Herculean efforts to have a chance to win, and then even perhaps not win. Whereas, unfortunately, because of human psychology, if you play in an amazing team, you don't always have to be 100% sort of fighting for your life. You have to have your back against the wall to bring out everything in you. So here's a question I have along these lines then, is when they did make some moves that looked like actually they could have potential, like, I mean, the Rascal one's an obvious what if, and how did that, I think to me that's one of the ones that's criminal, because people just brush that one to one side and they're still like, but why Taimu can't? It's like, more important to me is like, why a real quality player who, as we discussed on Overwatch, probably will be in the Overwatch League next season, or even perhaps on a very good team. Could this have been a player that could have been kind of what you're talking about, someone where at least there's like a kindred component and he kind of has a serious mindset, and at least we've got two good players. It's almost like a peace offering at that point in time. You can make it work. What do you think on that situation?
Yeah, I think that was the last straw that broke the camel's back for Effect. If we're looking at the timelines and how his play developed, once Rascal was kicked, he was basically playing on his own once again. And it's almost, you could almost read his mindset, how it changed from before Rascal was still in and there was still hope. And there was this other guy that sort of feels about winning the same, or at least at least comparably. I'm not sure if anyone feels as strongly about winning in the Overwatch League as Affect does.
I'm sure it's just relative to his teammates in Dallas Fuel that it matters, right?
Yeah, and then with OGE coming in, I mean, it looked up, right? There was some hope at the end of the tunnel, and then when they decided once again that the ego boat was full for Dallas Fuel, I suppose. So we don't actually know what really happened behind the scenes, obviously, with Rascal, why that was a no-go that they would continue to work together. I think that's just when Affect was like, okay, I'm breaking here. I think if this would have worked out and they actually developed synergy with each other, I think they could have been a duo like, for instance, Philly has, right? And Philly was notoriously a team that, so we, at Winston's Lab, we have a model called the PTK model. So the percentage of teams kills. And that sort of determines the play style of teams. So, for instance, most very successful teams in the past had a lot of the PTK share coming from the supportive stuff. So the front line, the back line, with Lunatic High, obviously, the front line and the back line were always like the strongest part, other than that one season where they had Who Are You? Or, I mean, just all those teams in Overwatch that had huge success were usually the ones that weren't carried by the DPS. Other than KDP, that was the interesting one with Rascal and Bertring, obviously. Yes. Who made it to the final, and now Philadelphia Fusion, where they sacrifice a lot of the PTK share, especially on the tanks, or especially on the main tank, I suppose, on the Winston, and give it to the DPS where they just take over and carry. And while this is empirically not the best way to play Overwatch, I mean, it's hard to argue with the bursts of skill ceiling that the Philadelphia Fusion has had over the season. I'm not sure if they would have, if that is a model that wins you the league or at least wins you the standings. Maybe you can get a peek in the playoffs, but it would have certainly propelled them higher in the standings, where now you have a DPS duo that when they can play off each other, and maybe if some main tank synergy then happens, I think that just becomes much more feasible. And especially, I would say even that this would then have triggered Siegel to go on the off tank and assist with the shot calling a little bit more. And that team would have probably done better, even though this is obviously highly speculative.
What about then? So obviously we don't have to run the thought experiment. As far as we know, there won't be any more Effect, at least in season one. Like, I mean, it's not really surprising. Obviously, they're basically done for season one anyway, so these aren't games where there's any point playing. If they really want to bring him back, I doubt it matters whether he performed in these matches or not. So, okay, there's a logic to that. So as a result, it's kind of unfair to judge these next games because it's not really the world without Effect, because he obviously could come back in the future and they might just kick everyone, etc. So give me the speculative version of the past then. If he hadn't have been there as a crutch, like either he just never joined in the first place, or he joined and then maybe actually he wasn't just this fucking Sisyphean character who can just endure any amount of toil, and he actually just decides early on, like, you know what, bench me for a while, or I want to go to Korea now and take a stage off. What would actually this team have looked like with this core or a couple of the past players? Could they have figured out some semblance? Like, for example, is there a world in which not having him and having no crutch actually means even just with the players they have, they get some better composition of players, or they find a way to use other players, like, you know, necessity being the mother of invention type scenario, that, you know, while they wouldn't have a player as good as Effect, they might have been a better team. Yeah.
I think what it would have probably triggered is maybe a different organizational spirit, how to approach Overwatch, possibly. We can't know, even though, I mean, there's some history to Hastra's approach to esports or team building. Yeah. But yeah, I think they would have made some changes there. I would argue that it's likely that Taimo wouldn't have fallen off as much if he had seen, so he needs to continue shot calling. And Taimo has historically been a bounce back redemption character where he sometimes falls from grace and then comes up and even peaks even higher than he was before. And that happened to him in IDDQD before, and that happened to him even within Envious before. Now, we can only speculate what, especially, for instance, in the last couple of stages, if we had known how dominant Widow could have been, or is in some teams, I wonder what would have happened if we had peak Taimu once again. I mean, highly speculative scenario. It's also maybe the backline would have, depending on who you slot in there, maybe the backline gets a little bit more guided, because that is famously, especially with Chips High, and I guess he doesn't call that much and is really someone that works around others. Maybe they could have gotten him a little bit out of the shell, because keep in mind, this guy was probably the 1A, 1B to Jaehong, who was considered one of the best players, if not the best player in the world at the time. So this guy definitely has potential. I wonder if they would have kept Mickey around. So I even more, I think that Apex Season 1 victory kept a lot of that stuff together. And then they obviously kept having domestic success. Rogue started struggling. That is also a heavy circumstance why Envious didn't improve as much. Because the best, I guess, comparison I have to that is the German Bundesliga, where Bayern had sort of like a 2 years where they lost the league against Dortmund, who pretty much dominated the league, and then Bayern had to come back. And these teams actually met in the Champions League final simply because they propelled German football off on each other, just racing to a higher level of play, making better signings, squeezing out maybe a little bit more resources here, and completely just by playing against each other and pushing themselves up and up. That sort of not only made them meet in the Champions League finals and making German football possibly the best in the world then, I would even argue that really helped Germany win the World Cup then, right? It's just elevating that level. So if Rogue hadn't fallen off as much as they did, and I mean, there were some rivals, but not to the quality. If I argue if Envious would have stayed the second team, which they were for a while in the domestic competition against Rogue, I think this team would have definitely entered Overwatch League much different. And I'm not sure if they would have been the best Western team with that core lineup, but if they would have definitely finished higher than what are they now, second to last.
Yeah. What about this then? So obviously some of the problems in this team, like a lot of complicated situations, there's not one factor, like it's not, for example, that people don't try or people aren't good enough. It's like, it's some of all of these factors at the same time, and it's never all of them with one player, for example. So whenever I've tried to, I mean, admittedly, it's super complicated to put all the stories together and contrast them because there's just way too much material out there. I guess in a sense, there was actually a genius to the Dallas Fuels approach, because if it had just been one of these things at each time, it would have been such a drama bomb. But they took the opposite approach of like just oversaturate the media with so much stuff, like no one can even get through all the information. So in what I was able to piece together, okay, some players, I think Taimu probably falls into this, lost all their confidence and felt like they couldn't even justify saying, give me this role in a team or put me in, coach, that sort of thing. So they kind of were broken. Then there was other players where they didn't take kindly to losing, or people telling them we're doing it the wrong way, and they were kind of rebellious. And then there was the people who, like, this will sound weird, but to me, someone like AKM's more like, because here's the problem. When AKM first came in, I hoped that he would actually be someone to work with effects. I thought, this is a guy who wants to fucking win. This is a guy who considers himself very good. But I have to say, from the little I know about him and what I've seen of some of his interactions, his problem seems to be, and this is unfortunately something of a French stereotype, just almost like an indifference. And that can actually be more tilting to certain types of people than someone who just flat out doesn't care. It's like he does care in a way, but it's like he's somehow a bit distant. And so the question is this, right? In the analogy I gave with Simple before, That's an extreme one because I can tell you actually, I mean, I've literally seen the practices and heard the voice comms. Some of the shit that he was doing was absolutely some of the most outrageous teammate stuff anyone's ever done, regardless of how good you are in your role. Like, it definitely will have a negative effect on the others. Now, obviously, I don't want to paint effect that way because we don't really know what he was like. And we only know from secondhand stories of people suggesting what his role in the team was and whether he was one of the people they got along with or not. Do you think he was also not suited to be a teammate of these other players? Like, was he? Do you think, is that a component, or did he just do his job and play his game, and that's irrelevant? Where would you come down on this one, or within the spectrum of it, obviously?
Yeah. So one thing is obviously language barrier, but I think another thing is actually, if you think of it as like an RPG, right? And everyone has different stamina bars. And it's actually not that you're always waiting on the guy with the least stamina. It goes, okay, the guy with the least stamina depletes, and then the group has to wait for him. And then they don't wait. They actually keep sprinting. And then this guy gets out of stamina, and then this guy, and then this guy, while this guy recuperates again, whatever. And they never seem to peak together or really, I guess, have the stamina to string along together, because there was always something happening in that team, and taking vocal leaders in, taking vocal leaders out. I mean, it's hard to, and it's probably also problematic to talk about these internal struggles. But yeah, I think in general, I'm not sure. The way Effect has been described to me is that he's a good teammate, and that nobody was really complaining. It's just that, yeah, I think nobody likes winning as much or wants to win as much as him. It's just, and I don't even think, if we're being reasonable, that this is even conduce or always results in the best outcome. The guy that wants it the most, sometimes you can be in a state where you want it too much and it actually fires back in a sense.
Sure. Okay, I thought a good way to end this episode would be a little bit of speculation, which is this. What do you think the Dallas Fuel will do with Effect, and what do you think they should do? Because there might be a distinction. Maybe it's the same answer. Who knows?
So, pre him going to Korea, I would have thought they would have just given him a blank check, just sign here, put the zeros yourself, and we will rebuild around you in season 2. Now I'm actually not.
Make the harsh cuts.
I think that they would have kicked before Effect went back to Korea. I think they would have kicked everyone else, probably. Now, maybe not everyone else. Maybe OGE would have been salvageable. Let me think. Maybe the French guys could have stuck around, depending on how they are doing in that organization. But I mean, it worked sort of in Valiant between the French guys and the Korean guys. So there seems to be some rapport between these two players and the Korean culture, I suppose. But or I guess in AKM's case, he wasn't part of that, but Anko and Soon were. And no, I think before that happened, they would have rebuilt around him. Now I'm not so sure. And I think, so as someone that wants to see basically the highest level of Overwatch possible, I think the best outcome would have been, or will be, that Effect goes to a more structured team. If that is a new buy-in, that's possible. If there's a big sponsor that has history of building very organized teams or whatever, and maybe there's even a new Korean slot or whatever, or something that wants, or some slot that wants to build around Koreans, I think that would help him. For Dallas, I mean, it sort of depends what you're, in a way, you already decided what your I mean, brand will be, in a sense, right? It's not even, I think Dallas entered trying to become the Manchester United that can actually win against Korean teams. That completely backfired. Then they also had a bunch of streamers. Like, they were by far the team with most social media interaction, the most cheers and whatever. So it really depends on what kind of direction I guess the leadership wants to take. I'm not sure how much of that actually Hasbro decides himself, but yeah, I think they can go either way. So it could both happen. It's equally likely. I think they should part ways though.
Hey guys, it's Dreamforce here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a Kiran? Well, this is 4-inch channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, 4-in kills a Seagull.
This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.